Good morning. Thank you very much for joining me on this video. I want to talk to you again today about tenanted property and selling tenanted property. We've dealt with it before and we need to do it again. It continues to be a problem. Agent called me and said, I've got a seller who owns a house they want to sell, but it's tenanted and they're on a 1-year lease. What do we do to get vacant possession so we can sell the property? Well, the simple answer is you can't. You can't get vacant possession. Even if you sell the property, the lease is binding on the new owner. Now, if you can negotiate something between the seller, landlord, and the tenant to have them vacate and they voluntarily sign an N11 to vacate the property, that's fine. As long as two people agree, you can do anything. But the chances are you're going to have to honor that lease. And I want to make sure you understand, at the end of the lease period, the tenant doesn't automatically vacate. At the end of the lease period, it becomes what's called a month-to-month overholding. And in fact, if the tenant wants to leave at the end of the 1-year lease, they have to give 2 months notice. They should give 2 months notice prior to the end of the lease. Or if they don't, they have to give 2 months notice and stay 2 months beyond the end of the lease. But the landlord can't do that. The landlord can't say, I want vacant possession, I'm not going to renew the lease. Now, if there's an automatic renewal provision in the lease for another year, they have to honor that. That's very unlikely. It's normal in a commercial, not so in a residential lease. But it becomes overholding, and the landlord can't evict the tenant except for very specific situations. He can evict them if they're a constant problem, if they're doing damage to the unit, if you're getting continual complaints from the neighbors or other units in the building. If they're not paying their rent, or if you need it for your own particular use for yourself or your immediate family, or if the buyer of the property needs it for themselves or their immediate family, those are justifiable reasons to give the tenant notice to vacate. Now, I should mention that, and I'm sure those of you who have dealt with this before have found that when you're selling a property that's occupied by a tenant, sometimes the tenants are very non-helpful, shall I say, in the selling process. If you want to show the property, you have to give minimum of 24-hour written notice to the tenant of your intention to show. Now, if you give the notice, the tenant can't stop you from showing the property. You can take a key and access the property if you wish. But we've had situations where the tenant is very non-cooperative, no time suitable, because the tenant, especially when rents have gone up so much in the last 3 or 4 years, the tenant doesn't want to leave. They may have a very preferential situation rent-wise. They don't want to leave. And so they're going to make it difficult for you to show it. When a buyer, potential buyer goes through, they're going to run down the property, tell you all the reasons why it's a problem property to buy. We had one situation where the tenant posted a sign in the door and said, all the occupants of this property have signs of COVID and we're not wearing masks. Anything they can to keep it from being shown. But you show the property, you get an offer, or you may get an offer conditional on inspecting the property. But you get an offer and the buyer wants vacant possession. Now, if the leases come to an end, or if it's a month-to-month overholding, then you as the agent, or in other words, the seller, can give the tenant 60 days from the start of a month notice that he has to vacate because the property is required by the new owner. The question is, what happens when that time comes if the tenant does not vacate? Well then, if you're representing the seller, you've got to anticipate that because you're putting the seller in a very awkward position. You see, the agreement of purchase and sale promises vacant possession unless otherwise provided in the contract. So the seller's saying, I'm going to give you vacant possession. But it's very difficult to commit to what a third party is going to do. The tenant may have even signed an N11 saying he's voluntarily going to leave, and the deadline comes and he doesn't leave. So if that's the case, the buyer has some choices. The buyer can walk away from the deal because he's not getting what he contracted to get, or the buyer can close the contract, assume the tenant, and go through the eviction process himself. But he can also go back on the seller for damages if he's got to take his furniture and put it in storage. He's got to delay his occupancy of that property because the tenant didn't vacate. So if you are representing the seller especially, you want to deal with that possibility. Now, AREA's got a great clause. It's probably a little heavy or onerous, but let me share it with you to put in an offer in a situation where the property is tenanted and the buyer wants vacant possession. The buyer hereby authorizes and directs the seller, and the seller agrees, when this agreement becomes unconditional, to give the tenants the requisite notice under the Residential Tenancies Act, requiring vacant possession of the property for the use by the buyer or the buyer's immediate family, effective as of the such and such day of such and such a month, 2021. And the seller agrees to deliver copies of the requisite notice to the buyer immediately after service of the notices to the tenants. The buyer and seller hereby agree, in the event that the tenant fails to vacate the property prior to completion of this transaction, the buyer agrees to assume the existing tenant upon completion of this transaction. So we've dealt with that. Upon vacant possession being provided to the buyer or the buyer's immediate family agrees to take possession of and occupy the property forthwith thereafter. The buyer agrees to provide the seller with a written indemnification on completion, indemnifying the seller from all actions, cause of action, claims, and demands of any kind whatsoever that may occur in the event that the buyer does not take possession of and occupy the property as aforesaid. Now, why have we got that in there? Because the landlord seller is the one that's giving notice to the tenant. Now, he's giving notice on behalf of the beneficial owner, the buyer, but he's saying the buyer needs vacant possession. Now, the tenant finds out that the buyer did that only to get vacant possession, re-rent the property at a much higher rent. The tenant's got 1 year to come back on the owner. Who he's going to come back on is the previous owner who gave him the notice. And so REA rightly puts in this indemnification saying, we'll show that we've given the prerequisite notice. You agree to close the transaction whether the tenant has vacated or not, but also, in the event that you don't move in and the tenant takes action, you indemnify us. Now, I don't know whether you want to put that onerous a clause in there. You certainly can, and it protects the buyer and it protects the agent. I can give you a little bit simplified one, which I'll share with you. The buyer authorizes and the seller agrees to give the tenant the requisite notice under the Residential Tenancies Act, requiring vacant possession of the property upon closing for use by the buyer. However, the seller does not warrant that the tenant will in fact vacate. In the unlikely event that the tenant fails to vacate, the buyer agrees to assume the existing tenant upon completion of this transaction. Now, I didn't put unconditional offer. I don't have a problem with giving the notice when the offer is conditional. If the offer falls through, then I can just revoke the notice. Rather than lose the critical time, the 7-day, 10-day, whatever the condition period is. And I've stated though, and by the way, I should say, even if the seller or the tenant has signed an N11 voluntarily agreeing to vacate, put the clause in. Because the tenant signing that he's going to vacate doesn't guarantee he's going to vacate. If he has a change of mind or something, or he talks to a buddy and says, you know, you can get the landlord to pay you some money, I wouldn't vacate. Whether he's got an N11 signed or whether you've got a court order under an N4, either way, you're going to have to exercise the court process to enact an eviction, and you're not going to get it done immediately. It's going to take some time. And in the meantime, you got a closing and a tenant occupying the property. So you want to make sure you got that clause in there to protect your seller. If you're a buyer, you maybe don't worry so much about it because the buyer's in control if the tenant doesn't move out, but you're heading for litigation one way or another, so you want to anticipate it. I hope that makes sense. I will put both those clauses on the screen for you to download, and you can take a look at them. You can use them if you like, but please don't just assume that the tenant's going to vacate on closing. Hope that makes sense. Thank you very much for taking time to watch this video. I'll talk to you again next week.